President George H.W. Bush was driven by foreign policy because that's where he was most comfortable. His philosophy altered that of Eisenhower, going to war 4 times and attacking countries head-on without the secrecy of Eisenhower's covert operations. Bush utilized his military to its full capacity, where Eisenhower's covert operations were completed only with a handful of soldiers. Harry S. Truman immediately stepped into a foreign policy maelstrom. The Soviet Union had begun an ominous push for control of Eastern Europe and across the world. War raged on in Japan. To complicate matters even further, this former Missouri farmer would soon control the most terrible weapon the world had ever known. Truman learned about the atomic bomb soon after becoming president. Now he agonized over whether to use the weapon against the Japanese. To do so might end the world quickly and minimize American casualties, but thousands of Japanese civilians would die. In June, a committee appointed by the president recommended using the bomb. Truman concurred. President George H.W. Bush, as the 41st president, serving in 1989 until 1993, brought to the White House a dedication of traditional American values and a determination to direct them towards making the United States a kinder and gentler nation in the face of a dramatically changing world. He appointed James Baker as Secretary of State in 1989. On January 9, 1991, Baker spoke at the Geneva Peace Conference and said, "If there is any user of chemical or biological weapons, our objective won't be just to liberate Kuwait, but the elimination of the current Iraqi regime." Later, he said that his intent was to threaten a retaliatory nuclear strike on Iraq. He helped construct the 34-nation alliance that fought alongside the U.S. in the Gulf War. Bush appointed Colin Powell to be the chairman of Joint Chiefs of Staff in 1989. This is the highest military position in the Department of Defense, and he was the first African American to reach this position. He became a national figure during Desert Storm and Desert Shield. He created the Powell Doctrine, which was a strategy which used overwhelming power and forces to maximize success and minimize casualties. He was a great man for this position because he understood war and knew the effects it had. During the Cold War, we wanted to stop the spread of communism in Latin America. Manuel Noriega, a native to Panama, started working in the CIA in the 1960s. Bush was the director of CIA and relied on Manuel for intelligence. Noriega started to aid the Sandinista government and became involved in drug trade. U.S. tried to cut ties with him. Noriega increased his power and gained control of the Panama military in 1980. Noriega started to aid the Sandinista government and became involved in drug trade. U.S. tried to cut ties with him. Noriega increased his power and gained control of the Panama military in 1983. He basically was a dictator of the country. Info about the internal coup reached the U.S. military in Panama, but Bush administration chose not to get involved because the plan seemed sketchy. The coup failed, and Manuel's forces executed the coup leader. Many critics criticized Bush for missing out on an opportunity to take Noriega out. Once this happened, Bush ordered his foreign affairs team to put together a plan to remove him. December 20th, the U.S. military launched Operation Just Cause and sent 10,000 troops to meet up with the 13,000 already there. Noriega surrendered to U.S. forces in early January. It was the largest military deployment since Vietnam War and showed Bush as a strong, decisive leader. When Bush became president in 1989, the U.S. had already begun to see a thawing of relations with the Soviet Union. Before becoming president in 1988, Bush, as the vice president, attended a summit between Reagan and the Soviet Premier Mikhail Gorbachev when East Germany opened its border and tore down the Berlin Wall in 1989. It marked a symbolic end to communist rule in Eastern Europe. To most people, it meant the Cold War was over. At a press conference on November 9th, Bush offered a muted response and said, "I am very pleased." He didn't show enthusiasm on the purpose, and it worked because it helped avoid backlash from Eastern Europe. He also didn't want to endanger future relations. While his noble sign of not acquiring victory over communism in Europe helped, it cost him at home because conservatives said Reagan would have celebrated with some type of public address. In 1990, they signed the Board of Arms Reduction Agreement. Both the Soviets and the U.S. decreased nuclear arsenals. In July of 1991, Bush met Gorbachev in Moscow and signed the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, known as START. In China, rulers brutally stopped student demonstrations in the Tiananmen Square in Beijing in the spring of 1989. The People's Liberation Army and the military, which was an arm of the Chinese government, used tanks and armored cars to suppress the pro-democracy movement in Beijing. 700 to 2,700 people were killed. President Bush personally knew the leaders of China and continued to keep contact with them after their own actions toward democracy, despite publicly condemning the massacre and suspending the sale of American weapons to China on June 5th. This angered human rights activists, but had hardly any effect on China. In 1990, they signed the Board of Arms Reduction Agreement. Both the Soviets and the U.S. decreased nuclear arsenals. In July of 1991, Bush met Gorbachev in Moscow and signed the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, known as START. In China, rulers brutally stopped student demonstrations in the Tiananmen Square in Beijing in the spring of 1989. The People's Liberation Army and the military, which was an arm of the Chinese government, used tanks and armored cars to suppress the pro-democracy movement in Beijing. 700 to 2,700 people were killed. President Bush personally knew the leaders of China and continued to keep contact with them after their own actions toward democracy, despite publicly condemning the massacre and suspending the sale of American weapons to China on June 5th. This angered human rights activists, but had hardly any effect on China's policy. In 1990, Bush met with South African's President F.W. de Klerk and Nelson Mandela. Bush supported sanctions against the South African government and appeared to be helping speed up the dismantling of racial separation in the country. The administration lifted these sanctions in 1991 after decisions were made that Congress requirements were met. In August of 1990, Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait over the right to control the oil in the area. This concerned Bush because he saw similarities between Hussein and Adolf Hitler and feared another mutiny situation. So, in November of 1990, the UN Security Council passed Resolution 678 that authorized the use of force against Hussein if he had not left Kuwait by January 15th of the following year. Operation Desert Shield came into effect in the U.S. and put troops in Saudi Arabia to combat Hussein if his army if needed. When it became clear that Hussein would not withdraw from Kuwait, Operation Desert Shield became Operation Desert Storm, and on January 17, 1991, the U.S. coalition, led by General Schwarzkopf, launched airstrikes against Hussein's army, signaling the beginning of the Persian Gulf War. After aiding 500,000 U.S. troops, Hussein was quickly overpowered, and the ceasefire was declared on February 28, 1991. And that's a wrap, folks. Here are our sources for this video that we made.